both at dawn. The faint glow of dawn seeped through the jagged edges of the forest canopy, painting the dirt-streaked faces of two men who hadn't slept in days. Private Frank Red, Carter leaned his head back against the rough bark of a tree, staring into the murky, pre-dawn sky. Beside him, Sergeant Tom Hawkins tugged a cigarette from his pocket, cupping his hands to shield the flame of a match. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke, the ghosts of last night's gunfire still hanging heavy in the silence. They weren't supposed to be alive. Hell, they weren't supposed to be here at all. Normandy was behind them, but the memory of it wasn't. Red still woke in cold sweats, the cries of dying men echoing in his skull. Tom, ever the stoic leader, never said much about that day. Yet Red could tell by the way Tom's hands trembled when he lit a cigarette or how his voice tightened during roll call that those ghosts followed him too. The two had been friends before the war, boys who shared beers behind barns and told lies about girls they'd never kissed. When the draft came, Tom enlisted first, dragging Red along like he always had. Now they were far from Kansas, with nothing but M1 rifles and each other to hold on to. That morning, as the horizon bled into light, Tom spoke for the first time in hours. "We're moving east. Command says there's a village up ahead, St. Clair. Word is, the Germans are digging in there." Red nodded, his jaw tight. He didn't need to ask what that meant. Every village was the same: cobblestone streets, crumbling walls, and civilians caught in the crossfire. He'd stopped counting how many faces he'd seen staring blankly from rubble, their eyes accusing and empty. The thought of St. Clair, of adding another town to the tally, made him want to retch. They pushed forward when the sun was barely above the trees. The squad trudged through fields where wheat swayed in golden defiance of the war that raged around it. Red couldn't help but think of home, of summer evenings on his parents' farm when the air buzzed with cicadas and the world seemed invincible. Here, the silence was too heavy, broken only by the occasional burst of distant artillery. When they reached the outskirts of St. Clair, the scene was eerily quiet. No barking dogs, no voices, no sound except the crunch of boots on gravel. Tom raised a fist, signaling the squad to halt. His sharp eyes scanned the village, narrowing at every shadow. Red felt the hair on his neck stand on end. "Something's not right," Tom muttered, barely loud enough for Red to hear. Before Red could respond, the first shot cracked through the air. Chaos erupted. Germans emerged like phantoms from doorways and windows, their machine guns spitting fire. Red dove behind a low stone wall, his heart hammering as bullets chewed through the dirt around him. He fumbled for his rifle, his fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. Tom was already shouting orders, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "Flank left. Red, cover fire." Red didn't think, he acted. Rising just enough to fire over the wall, he squeezed the trigger, the rifle kicking against his shoulder. The enemy's return fire was deafening, but he kept shooting, his mind blank except for Tom's voice anchoring him. When the dust finally settled, the village was a graveyard. Bodies, German and American alike, littered the streets. The acrid stench of gunpowder mixed with a coppery tang of blood. Red staggered to his feet, his legs trembling. His ears rang, and his vision swam, but he was alive. Against all odds, he was alive. Tom approached, his face grim. "We've got to move. Reinforcements could be here any minute." Red nodded, though his stomach churned at the thought of leaving the fallen behind. He cast one last glance at the lifeless forms around him, silently vowing he'd never forget their faces. As he followed Tom out of St. Clair, the first rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon, turning the blood-soaked cobblestones to gold. For a brief, fleeting moment, it almost looked like home. They didn't stop moving until the sun was high overhead, its relentless heat beating down on their weary bodies. The forest offered little shade, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made Red's pulse spike. Tom led the squad with unwavering focus, his silhouette sharp and unyielding against the dappled sunlight. Red envied that, the way Tom always seemed to know where to go, what to do. It was a strength Red clung to, even as his own resolve wavered. By midday, they reached a clearing where a narrow stream cut through the landscape. Tom signaled for a break, and the men collapsed onto the grass, their breaths ragged. Red knelt by the water, splashing his face and neck. The coolness was a brief reprieve, though it did little to wash away the grime and blood that clung to him like a second skin. "We'll rest here for an hour," Tom announced, his voice firm but low. "Keep your eyes open. No fires. No noise. Red settled against a rock, his rifle resting across his lap. The others murmured among themselves, their voices hushed and cautious. No one laughed anymore, not like they used to. The jokes and banter that had once filled their nights were gone, buried beneath the weight of everything they'd seen. Red tried to remember the sound of his own laughter, but it felt like a distant memory, something that belonged to another life. He closed his eyes, letting the gentle babble of the stream lull him into a fragile sense of calm. Images from St. Clair flickered behind his eyelids, flashes of gunfire, the contorted faces of the dying. He clenched his fists, willing the memories to fade, but they clung to him like shadows. Tom's voice broke through his thoughts. "Red, with me." Red opened his eyes to find Tom standing over him, his expression unreadable. Without a word, Red pushed himself to his feet and followed. They walked a short distance away from the others, stopping beneath a cluster of trees where the air was cooler. Tom leaned against a trunk, his arms crossed over his chest. "What's on your mind?" Tom asked, his tone softer than usual. Red hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ground. "St. Clair. Those people, we couldn't save them." Tom's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something Red couldn't quite place. "You think I don't feel it too? Every damn village, every street, it's the same. We do what we can, but it's never enough. You've got to learn to live with it, or it'll eat you alive." Red looked up, meeting Tom's gaze. There was no anger there, no judgment. Just a quiet understanding that made Red's chest ache. He nodded, though the weight of it didn't feel any lighter. Before they could say more, a shout echoed from the clearing. Both men tensed, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. They hurried back to find the squad on high alert, rifles raised and eyes scanning the trees. "What is it?" Tom demanded. Private Jenkins, a wiry kid barely out of high school, pointed toward the tree line. "Thought I saw something moving out there. Could have been nothing, but..." Tom's gaze followed Jenkins' finger, his eyes narrowing. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing in like a physical force. Red's grip tightened on his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Then, a low rustling broke the stillness. The squad braced themselves, fingers on triggers, but what emerged from the shadows wasn't an enemy soldier. It was a young girl, no older than 10, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She held a bundle of cloth to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. The sight of her stopped Red's breath. He glanced at Tom, whose expression had softened, though his posture remained guarded. Slowly, Tom lowered his weapon and stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "It's okay," he said gently. "We won't hurt you." The girl didn't move, her gaze darting between the soldiers. Red's heart ached for her, for the terror etched into her small face. He took a step closer, kneeling to meet her eye level. "Are you alone?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then nodded, clutching the bundle tighter. Red's stomach twisted as he realized what it was, a swaddled infant, its tiny face peeking out from the cloth. The girl's lips trembled as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Help us." Tom crouched down, his hands still raised, the hard edge in his voice replaced with a gentle calm. The girl didn't flinch as he approached. Her trembling betrayed the fear she tried to conceal. "What's your name?" Tom asked softly, keeping his movements deliberate. The girl hesitated, her wide eyes flickering to the other soldiers before returning to Tom. "Marie," she whispered, her accent thick with the lilting rhythm of French countryside. Tom nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Marie, we're here to help. You and your brother, you'll be safe with us." Red wasn't sure how Tom could promise such a thing. Not here, not in this place where safety was a lie. But the words seemed to reach her. Marie stepped forward, her bare feet crunching softly against the dry leaves, her bundle clutched tight. Red noticed the infant's tiny fingers poking out from the fabric, impossibly fragile. A lump rose in his throat. These kids didn't belong here, not in this nightmare of shattered homes and screaming skies. But then again, neither did they. Tom stood, gesturing for Jenkins and another soldier to check the area where the girl had come from. "Make sure it's clear," he said, his voice low but firm. The men nodded and disappeared into the trees, their weapons at the ready. Marie's gaze lingered on Red, as if sensing something in him. He forced a small smile, his heart heavy. "Where are your parents?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. Red swallowed hard, glancing at Tom, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. They wouldn't press her for details. Whatever happened to her family, it was written plainly in the haunted shadows of her eyes. Minutes passed like hours as they waited for Jenkins and the others to return. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the weight of unseen threats pressing down on them. Red stayed close to Marie, watching her rock the infant gently. Despite everything, she moved with a tenderness that tugged at something deep inside him. Finally, the men returned, their expressions grim. "No sign of anyone else," Jenkins reported. "But there's a trail fresh. Could be crowds." Tom cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. He glanced at Marie, then back at the squad. "We need to move. If they're tracking her, we're sitting ducks here." The men nodded, their faces set with grim determination. No one questioned the decision to take Marie and the baby with them, though Red could see the unease in their eyes. A child was a liability, a slow-moving target in a war where hesitation could mean death. But leaving her behind? That wasn't an option. Not for men like Tom. They moved swiftly, their formation tighter than before. Red stayed near Marie, his senses heightened with every step. The girl walked with surprising resilience, her bare feet navigating the rough terrain without complaint. The baby made no sound, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Tom led the way, his sharp eyes scanning the forest ahead. The squad moved in tense silence, their breath shallow, their weapons ready. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a branch set their nerves on edge. Red's grip on his rifle was slick with sweat, his pulse pounding in his ears. Hours passed before they reached another clearing. This one was smaller, surrounded by dense trees that offered some cover. Tom signaled for a halt, his hand raised. The men dropped to their knees, their eyes darting warily toward the shadows. "We'll rest here for a bit," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But stay sharp." Marie sank to the ground, her face pale with exhaustion. Red knelt beside her, offering his canteen. She hesitated before taking it, her small hands trembling as she drank. The sight made Red's chest tighten. She was just a kid, too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, but old enough to know fear. Tom approached, crouching down to meet her gaze. "We're going to get you somewhere safe," he said, his tone as steady as the ground beneath them. "But you have to trust us, okay?" Marie nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She glanced at the baby, then back at Tom. "Promise?" she asked, her voice so small it nearly broke. Tom hesitated, his jaw tightening. Red saw the conflict in his eyes, the knowledge that promises were fragile things in a world like this. But then Tom nodded. "I promise." The words hung heavy in the air, as though the forest itself held its breath. The next hour passed uneventfully, but the tension remained. Red sat with his back to a tree, his rifle resting across his knees. He watched Marie as she dozed lightly, the baby cradled in her arms. She looked so small, so fragile, and yet there was a quiet strength in her that left Red in awe. He glanced at Tom, who was speaking quietly with Jenkins and another soldier. Their expressions were serious, their voices too low for Red to hear. He wondered what Tom was planning, what dangers lay ahead. The thought made his stomach churn. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing, Tom stood and signaled for the squad to move out. Red helped Marie to her feet, his hand gentle on her shoulder. She looked up at him with tired eyes, and he offered her a small, reassuring smile. They moved carefully, their steps muffled against the forest floor. The air grew cooler as the day faded, the light taking on a golden hue. Red tried to focus on the path ahead, but his mind kept drifting, to Marie, to the promise Tom had made, to the weight of the war that pressed down on all of them. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Tom raised a fist, signaling another halt. The squad froze, their eyes scanning the surroundings. Red's pulse quickened as he tightened his grip on his rifle. "What is it?" Red whispered, stepping closer to Tom. Tom didn't answer immediately. He stared into the shadows, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Red, his voice low and firm. "Stay close. Something's not right." Red's heart pounded as he nodded, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The forest seemed to close in around them, the silence oppressive. And then, from somewhere deep in the shadows, came the sound they had all been dreading, the distant, metallic clink of boots on stone. They weren't alone. The sound of boots echoed faintly, each step deliberate and measured. It was close enough to set every nerve in Red's body alight, yet distant enough to keep their enemy hidden. He scanned the darkening tree-line, his rifle steady but his pulse racing. The others had already taken defensive positions, their faces taut with anticipation. Tom moved like a shadow, crouching low as he gestured for silence. His sharp gaze darted between the men, then back toward the sound. Red saw the tension in his jaw, the barely perceptible quiver of his hand as he signaled for Jenkins to take the flank. The boy nodded, his face pale but resolute, and disappeared into the trees. Marie clung to Red's side, her small frame trembling. He felt her fingers grip his sleeve, and though his instinct screamed to focus on the danger, he couldn't ignore her fear. Lowering himself to her level, he whispered, "Stay behind me. Don't move unless I tell you." "Understand." She nodded, her eyes wide and glistening. The baby in her arms remained eerily silent, as though it too understood the gravity of the moment. The clinking of boots grew louder, now accompanied by the faint rustle of leaves. Whoever it was, they were trying to move carefully, but not carefully enough. Tom's hand shot up, halting everyone in place. The squad waited, the tension so thick Red could feel it pressing against his chest. Then came a voice harsh and guttural, speaking rapid German. It wasn't a single man. There were several, maybe half a dozen or more. Red's grip tightened on his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. Tom crept back toward the group, his voice a whisper so faint it barely reached them. "Ambush point. Stay low. We wait for them to pass." Red nodded, though his gut churned. Waiting meant letting the enemy get close, too close. But Tom had earned their trust 100 times over. If he said to wait, they would wait. The minutes dragged on as the voices drew nearer. Red's breathing felt too loud, his heartbeat a deafening drumbeat in his ears. Beside him, Marie crouched low, her small body pressed against his for support. He kept one hand on his rifle and the other on her shoulder, steadying them both. And then they appeared. Through the tangled underbrush, Red caught glimpses of their silhouettes, dark shapes moving in a loose formation, their rifles slung casually but ready. There were at least 7, maybe 8 of them, their boots crunching softly against the forest floor. The fading light cast long shadows across their faces, but Red could see their expressions, alert, cautious, and cold. He counted their steps, his muscles coiled like a spring. 5 feet. 4. 3. Tom's signal came fast, a clenched fist, then a downward swipe. The squad moved as one, rising from their positions and opening fire in a synchronized burst. The forest exploded into chaos. The Germans were caught off guard, their formation breaking as bullets tore through the air. Red fired without hesitation, his aim steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. One enemy went down, then another. Marie screamed, a sharp piercing sound that cut through the gunfire. Red turned instinctively, his heart lurching as he saw her stumble backward, her arms clutching the baby tightly. A stray bullet had struck the ground inches from her feet, spraying dirt into the air. "Marie!" he shouted, rushing to her side. She was unhurt, but the terror in her eyes was unmistakable. Red scooped her up, his free arm cradling her protectively as he retreated behind a fallen log. "Stay down," he barked, his voice rough with urgency. The fight was over in minutes, though it felt like hours. When the last shot rang out, the forest fell silent again, save for the ragged breathing of the squad. Red peeked over the log, his rifle still raised, scanning for any sign of movement. "All clear," Tom called, his voice hoarse but steady. Red exhaled shakily, his arms still wrapped around Marie. She looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. The baby squirmed in her grasp, letting out a soft, plaintive cry, the first sound it had made. "It's over," Red murmured, though the words felt hollow. Nothing was ever truly over out here. Tom approached, his face lined with exhaustion. "Everyone okay?" There were murmurs of affirmation from the squad, though the weight of what had just happened was etched into their faces. Red nodded, pulling Marie closer as he met Tom's gaze. "We can't stay here," Tom said, his tone grim. "If that patrol doesn't report back, they'll send more." Red knew he was right, but the thought of moving again, of dragging Marie and the baby deeper into this hellscape, made his stomach twist. Still, There was no other choice. They gathered what little supplies they could from the fallen soldiers before pressing on, their movements more cautious than ever. The forest grew darker as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air heavy with the scent of gunpowder and fear. Red stayed close to Marie, his hand never leaving the rifle slung across his chest. The promise Tom had made to her echoed in his mind, a fragile thread of hope in a world that seemed determined to snuff it out. As they trudged through the shadows, Red glanced at Tom, whose silhouette remained steadfast at the front of the group. He wondered how Tom carried it all, the responsibility, the guilt, the unspoken fears that gnawed at them all. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an owl. And yet, even in the quiet, Red couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't over. Not yet. The forest grew denser with each step, the canopy above twisting into a tangled mass that blocked even the faintest traces of moonlight. Shadows stretched long and deep, shifting with every movement of the squad. Red's every sense was on edge, his ears straining for a sound that didn't belong, his eyes scanning every patch of darkness for something, anything that moved. Tom's hand shot up suddenly, his fist clenched in a signal to halt. The squad froze as one, their breath shallow, their weapons raised. "What is it?" Red whispered, his voice barely audible. Tom didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on something ahead, his posture tense. Red followed his gaze, but the thick undergrowth obscured whatever had caught Tom's attention. Seconds ticked by, stretching into an eternity. Then faintly, Red heard it too, a soft rustle, deliberate and measured, coming from the left. Tom motioned for the squad to fan out, his movements slow and precise. Red tightened his grip on his rifle, his palms slick with sweat. Marie clung to his side, her breathing rapid but silent. He gestured for her to stay low, his heart pounding as the rustling grew louder. The first figure emerged from the trees, a German soldier with his rifle slung casually over one shoulder. He was young, no older than Jenkins, with a face that looked more tired than menacing. Behind him, another soldier appeared, then another. Red's pulse quickened. There were too many. Tom turned back toward the squad, his hand poised to give the signal to engage. But before he could move, the forest erupted with light. Flare guns shot into the sky, their blinding glare illuminating the entire clearing. Red's stomach dropped as he realized they were surrounded. German voices barked orders from every direction, their harsh tones slicing through the night. "Ambush!" Tom shouted, diving for cover as bullets tore through the air. Red grabbed Marie, pulling her to the ground and shielding her with his body. He fired blindly toward the nearest source of light, the recoil jolting his shoulder. The forest became a cacophony of gunfire and shouting, the sharp cracks of rifles punctuated by the screams of the wounded. Jenkins went down first, a single shot to the chest sending him crumpling to the ground. Red barely registered the loss, his focus narrowing to survival. Tom's voice rang out over the chaos, issuing orders with the clarity of a man who'd faced death too many times to fear it. "Fall back. Regroup by the ridge." Red hesitated, glancing at Marie. "Go with them," he urged, pushing her toward the others. She hesitated, her wide eyes locked on his, but when he gave her a firm shove, she clutched the baby tighter and ran. The squad retreated in bursts, covering one another as they moved toward the ridge. Red stayed close to Tom, his rifle spitting fire at anything that moved. The forest seemed endless, every tree a potential enemy, every shadow a threat. Red's lungs burned, his legs screaming with each step, but he didn't stop. The sound of pursuit was close behind, voices shouting in German, the crack of branches under heavy boots. When they finally reached the ridge, the squad regrouped behind a line of boulders, their breathing labored and uneven. Tom's sharp eyes scanned the terrain, his jaw clenched as he counted heads. "Where's Jenkins?" someone asked, their voice trembling. Red didn't answer. He couldn't. "Gone," Tom said, his voice flat. "Keep moving." Marie was huddled against one of the rocks, her face streaked with dirt and tears. The baby whimpered softly in her arms, its tiny cries barely audible over the pounding of Red's heart. He crouched beside her, his hand brushing her shoulder in a silent gesture of reassurance. "We're not safe here," Tom said, his voice low but urgent. "They'll be on us any minute. We need to keep moving." Red nodded, though his body screamed for rest. He reached for Marie, helping her to her feet. She clung to him, her small frame trembling, but she didn't protest. The squad moved again, their pace slower now, their movements more deliberate. The forest seemed to close in around them, the darkness pressing in like a physical force. Red couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another ambush. The Germans weren't just hunting them, they were driving them, herding them towards something. He caught Tom's eye, the unspoken question hanging between them. But Tom's face gave nothing away, his expression as unreadable as ever. The night stretched on, each step heavier than the last. The squad moved in near silence, their breath shallow, their eyes darting toward every sound. And yet, no more shots came. No voices called out. The Germans had vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared. It wasn't until the first rays of dawn began to break through the trees that Red realized where they were. The forest ended abruptly, giving way to a wide, open field. Beyond it, a small farmhouse stood silhouetted against the rising sun. Tom raised a hand, signaling for the squad to stop. His eyes scanned the horizon, his body taut with tension. "Trap?" Red asked, his voice hoarse. Tom nodded slowly, his hand tightening around his rifle. "Probably." The squad huddled together, their eyes fixed on the farmhouse. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Tom turned to Red, his expression grim but resolute. "We go together," he said. "No one gets left behind." Red nodded, his chest tightening. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its shadow long and foreboding. And as they moved toward it, Red couldn't help but wonder if they were walking toward salvation, or their final stand. The farmhouse stood like a sentinel at the edge of the field, its weathered gray with age and streaked with shadows from the rising sun. It seemed both lifeless and alive, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for them to approach. Tom led the way, his rifle raised, his steps deliberate but steady. The squad followed in a tight formation, their bodies hunched and tense, ready for the worst. Red stayed close to Marie, his hand resting on her shoulder as they moved. He could feel her trembling, the fear radiating off her in waves, but she kept pace without a word. As they reached the edge of the field, Tom motioned for the squad to fan out. Red took up a position near the left side of the house, his back pressed against the rough wood of the exterior wall. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, sharpening his senses. Tom signaled with a quick gesture, a silent countdown. 3, 2, 1. The door burst open with a loud crack, splintering against the wall as Tom kicked it in. The squad swept inside, their rifles raised, their eyes scanning every corner of the dimly lit interior. It was empty. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Red stepped cautiously into the room, his fingers still on the trigger, his gaze darting to the shadows that clung to the walls. The farmhouse was small, just a single room with a dirt floor and a few pieces of broken furniture scattered about. A ladder leaned against one wall, leading up to a loft that sagged under its own weight. "It's clear," Tom said, his voice low but firm. Red let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He lowered his rifle slightly, his eyes still scanning for any sign of danger. Marie stepped in behind him, clutching the baby to her chest. "Why would they drive us here?" Red asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom didn't answer immediately. He was staring at something on the far wall, a map pinned to the wood with a rusted nail. Red moved closer, his curiosity piqued. The map was old and yellowed, its edges frayed, but it was unmistakably a map of the region. Red's eyes traced the markings, his stomach twisting as he realized what he was looking at. The farmhouse was circled. Before Red could say anything, a sharp crack echoed from above. The squad froze, their eyes snapping to the loft. The sound of creaking would followed, slow and deliberate, like someone shifting their weight. Tom raised his rifle, his body tense. "Who's up there?" No response. Another creak. Red's grip tightened on his rifle as he took a step back, positioning himself between Marie and the ladder. The silence was suffocating, each second dragging on like an eternity. Then a voice. It was low and raspy, speaking in German. Red couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't angry or desperate, it was calm. Too calm. Tom barked an order in German, demanding the speakers show themselves. The voice responded, still calm, still unhurried. And then a single figure descended the ladder. The man was older, his face lined with age and exhaustion. He wore a tattered German uniform, the insignia barely visible beneath the dirt and grime. But it wasn't his appearance that unnerved Red. It was his eyes. They were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of fear. The man stepped off the ladder, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He spoke again, his voice steady. Tom frowned, his grip on his rifle unwavering. He says he's the only one left, that his unit abandoned him here. Do we believe him? Red asked, his voice tight. Tom didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the man, his rifle still trained on him. The two locked eyes, a silent standoff that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, Tom spoke again, his voice sharp. Why the map? Why circle this place? The man hesitated, his gaze flickering to the map on the wall. He said something in German, his tone almost mocking. He says it's a sanctuary, Tom translated, his voice laced with skepticism. A sanctuary? Red echoed, his brow furrowing. The man nodded, his expression inscrutable. He said something else, his voice growing softer, almost wistful. Tom's jaw tightened as he translated. He says this place is sacred, that no one spills blood here. Red's stomach churned. The idea of sanctity in a war like this felt like a cruel joke. What do we do with him? One of the other soldiers asked, breaking the tense silence. Tom didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the man, then at the squad, then back at the man. The weight of the decision was written all over his face. Finally, he lowered his rifle. We keep moving, he said. If he's lying, we'll know soon enough. The squad exchanged uneasy glances but didn't argue. As they prepared to leave, the man stepped aside, making no move to stop them. Red couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far worse than they'd left behind. As they stepped out into the light of dawn, the farmhouse stood behind them, still and silent, as if it had never been there at all. The squad moved quickly, the farmhouse shrinking behind them like a memory they wanted to forget. The silence of the fields was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of boots on dry earth and the faint rustle of wind through the tall grass. Every shadow felt like it had eyes, every sound like a warning. Red stayed near the back of the formation, his gaze constantly flicking over his shoulder. Marie walked close to him, her small steps keeping pace with surprising steadiness. She hadn't said a word since the encounter in the farmhouse, but her grip on the baby had tightened, her knuckles white against the cloth. Do you believe him? Red whispered, glancing at Tom ahead of him. Tom didn't turn, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I believe we're still alive. That's all that matters. It wasn't the answer Red wanted, but it was the only one he expected. Tom's ability to compartmentalize had always been both a strength and a burden. Red admired it, envied it even, but he couldn't share it. The weight of doubt and fear clung to him like a second skin. The terrain began to shift as they moved farther east. The fields gave way to denser forest, the canopy above blotting out much of the early morning light. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like twisted hands. The squad stopped near a shallow stream, the water trickling over smooth stones. Tom raised a hand, signaling for them to rest. We'll move again in 10 minutes, he said, his voice low but commanding. Red knelt by the water, splashing his face. The cold bit at his skin, grounding him momentarily. Marie sat a few feet away, cradling the baby. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, but she didn't cry. Red marveled at her resilience, though it only made him more uneasy. What's your story, kid? Red asked quietly, not expecting an answer. Marie looked up at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, it seemed like she might speak, but she only shook her head and turned away. Red sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know the answer. A sudden snap of a twig broke the stillness. The squad froze, their hands moving to their weapons in unison. Tom's eyes darted toward the trees, his body tense. Stay low, he murmured. The sound came again, this time closer. Red's heart pounded as he scanned the dense undergrowth, his rifle raised. A shadow moved between the trees, quick and fleeting. Tom gestured for the squad to spread out, their movements slow and deliberate. Red felt his pulse hammering in his ears as he shifted position, his back pressed against the rough bark of a tree. The shadow moved again, this time accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Red's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't human. What the hell is that? Private Jenkins whispered, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the underbrush exploded in a flurry of motion. A massive dog burst into the clearing, its fur matted and its eyes wild. It snarled, baring yellow teeth as it crouched low, preparing to lunge. "Hold fire," Tom barked, raising a hand. The dog's growl deepened, its muscles coiling like a spring. Red tightened his grip on his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the dog stopped. Its ears perked up, and its gaze shifted past the squad, toward the trees. A low whimper escaped its throat before it turned and bolted, disappearing into the forest as quickly as it had come. The squad stood in stunned silence, their weapons still raised. What scared it off? Red muttered, more to himself than anyone else. No one had an answer. Tom straightened, his jaw set. "We keep moving. Stay sharp." The unease in the group was palpable as they resumed their march. The dog's sudden appearance, and its even more abrupt departure, hung over them like a dark cloud. Red couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had driven the animal away was still watching them. The forest grew denser as they pressed on, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the thick canopy. The air felt heavier, charged with an almost electric tension. Even the birds had gone silent, their absence amplifying every snap of a twig or crunch of leaves beneath their boots. Marie clung closer to Red, her small frame pressed against his side. He glanced down at her, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "We're almost there," he said, though he wasn't sure where there was anymore. Tom came to an abrupt stop, raising a fist. The squad halted, their weapons at the ready. Ahead, the forest opened into a clearing. In the center stood a stone structure, ancient and weathered, its surface covered in moss and ivy. It looked like a chapel, though its crumbling walls and broken roof suggested it hadn't been used in decades. "Is that?" Red began, but his voice trailed off. Tom nodded, his eyes narrowing. "The map. This is the place." The squad exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Tom took a cautious step forward, his rifle raised. "Stay close," he ordered. The group moved toward the chapel, their movements slow and deliberate. The closer they got, the more oppressive the air became. It was as if the very ground beneath them was holding its breath. As they reached the entrance, a low sound echoed from within. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down Red's spine. Tom glanced back at the squad, his expression grim. "Ready?" Red nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever lay inside, they would face it together. And with that, they stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. Dust particles danced in the narrow beams of light that pierced through cracks in the crumbling roof. The silence was so complete that Red could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. The chapel's interior was eerily intact. Rows of wooden pews, warped and splintered by time, lined the aisle. At the far end, an altar stood shrouded in shadow, its surface draped in tattered cloth. A massive crucifix hung crookedly on the wall behind it, its once polished wood now dull and splintered. "Fan out," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. The squad moved cautiously, their boots scuffing against the stone floor. Red stayed close to Marie, his rifle raised and his eyes scanning every corner. The chapel felt alive in a way that unnerved him, like it had been waiting for them. Jenkins approached the altar, his steps hesitant. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the cloth. "Careful," Tom warned, but it was too late. Jenkins yanked the cloth away, revealing a small wooden box beneath. Its surface was intricately carved with symbols Red didn't recognize, the grooves filled with a dark, tar-like substance. "What the hell is that?" Jenkins asked, his voice shaky. Tom stepped forward, his expression hard. "Don't touch it." Jenkins took a step back, his hands raised. "I wasn't going to." Marie, still clutching the baby, stared at the box with wide, unblinking eyes. She whispered something under her breath, too quiet for Red to hear. "What did you say?" Red asked, kneeling beside her. She looked at him, her face pale. "It's cursed." The words sent a shiver down Red's spine. Tom glanced at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Marie hesitated, her gaze flicking between the box and the soldiers. "My father, he said there are places you don't go. Things you don't disturb. He told me stories about this chapel. About the box. It's why no one comes here." Red swallowed hard, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Superstition," Tom said, though there was no conviction in his voice. Before anyone could respond, a low guttural sound echoed through the chapel. It wasn't human. Red spun around, his rifle raised, but there was nothing there. Did anyone else hear that? Jenkins asked, his voice trembling. The sound came again, louder this time. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the stone walls. "Stay together," Tom ordered, his voice tense. The squad closed ranks, their weapons aimed at the shadows. The sound grew louder, transforming into a cacophony of whispers, each voice overlapping the next. Marie clung to Red, small frame trembling. The baby began to cry, the sound piercing through the oppressive atmosphere. "What's happening?" Jenkins whispered, his eyes darting wildly. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Tom took a cautious step toward the altar, his eyes fixed on the box. "Whatever's happening, it's connected to this." "Tom, maybe we should leave it alone," Red said, his voice strained. Tom shook his head. "We can't. Command sent us here for a reason. If this thing is important to the enemy, we can't just walk away." Before Red could argue, Tom reached for the box. The moment his fingers touched the wood, the air in the chapel shifted. The temperature plummeted, and a gust of wind howled through the room, though the doors remained closed. The crucifix on the wall fell with a deafening crash, splintering on the floor. "Tom!" Red shouted, rushing to his friend's side. Tom staggered back, his face pale and his eyes wide. I didn't do anything." The box began to hum, a low vibration that rattled the floor beneath their feet. The dark substance in the carving started to glow, emitting an eerie, pulsating light. "We need to go," Red said, his voice rising in panic. "No," Tom said firmly, though his hands trembled. "We finished the mission." Before anyone could stop him, Tom lifted the box. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, as if the very walls of the chapel were protesting. The baby's cries turned into wails, and Marie clutched him tighter, tears streaming down her face. "We're not supposed to be here," she sobbed. Tom ignored her, his focus entirely on the box. The whispers coalesced into a single booming voice that filled the chapel, shaking the very ground beneath them. "Leave, or face the reckoning." The voice was neither male nor female, neither human nor inhuman. It was ancient, full of rage and sorrow. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if responding to the command, the shadows in the room began to shift and take form. Dark figures emerged, their features indistinct but their presence overwhelming. "Run!" Tom shouted. The squad bolted for the door, their panic overriding any semblance of order. Red grabbed Marie, pulling her along as the shadows closed in. They burst out into the forest, the cool night air hitting them like a slap. The whispers and the voices didn't follow, but the oppressive feeling lingered. Tom still held the box, his knuckles wide against the wood. What the hell was that? Jenkins gasped, his chest heaving. Tom didn't answer. Red looked at him, his eyes burning with fury. "Tom, what are we doing? What is this?" Tom met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "We're following orders." The words felt hollow, but there was no time to argue. In the distance, the faint glow of dawn began to creep over the horizon. But for the first time, its warmth offered no comfort. It wasn't over. Not yet.